This is a new piece of work for me. You'll see that there's some old themes in it, but it's really brand new stuff, which is more, I think, specifically than I've done in a while, designed to try to help myself and others, I hope, understand things that are going on in the world today, the world that I live in anyway. We all live in, because we're flocking together like birds. So here we go. So on 24th of April of this year, in Savar, a suburb north of Dhaka, Bangladesh, an 8-story building called Rana Plaza, which was designed as a department store and was serving instead as a garment factory, was overloaded with workers, sewing machines, generators, and tons of cloth, and then collapsed without warning. The search for survivors ended 3 weeks later, the 13th of May, the collapse. The search for survivors went on for another 3 weeks, and eventually the official death toll was listed as 1,127. It was probably way over 1,200, and about 2,500 injured people were finally rescued. The world news coverage of this event was really quite massive. The Economist called it South Asia's worst industrial accidents since the Bhopal disaster of 1984, when a gas leak at a Union Carbide fertilizer plant in central India killed at least 3,800 people. Much of the coverage of the Rana Plaza was very critical of global corporate system that allows for this tragedy to occur at the same time as investors profit and consumers benefit from the dangerous work of so many poorly paid Bangladeshi workers, mostly women, young women, who stitch cloth for many well-known designer labels and for a long list of mid-range and bargain retailers in rich countries, including Gap, H&M, Walmart, Primark, Mango, and Benetton. Internet photography of this event has been extensive and quite horrifying. You can find any number of pictures on the web, and the visceral connection that was made by all this coverage between corporate profits and the suffering of workers was really all over the headlines and the internet for the better part of a month, and periodically it shows up again. One very outspoken critic named Jeremy Seabrook called the building collapse corporate manslaughter, and even the Pope chimed in by calling Bangladeshi garment workers slave labor. Official responses from the relevant corporate headquarters in rich countries ranged from crude denials of responsibility, more typical in the U.S., to public expressions of concern and commitment to help victims and prevent future catastrophes, which was more typical in Europe. As with the Union Carbide disaster, the legal question of corporate liability loomed large. How can global corporations be held legally accountable for deadly results of negligence and malfeasance that would never be tolerated in their home countries? It's noteworthy in this respect that Union Carbide escaped liability for Bhopal, and at the same time, on the other side of the coin, British Petroleum has paid billions of dollars to clean up and rehabilitate coastal areas of the United States damaged by a BP oil spill. So clearly the liability for Western corporations is quite different when you're in a Western country and when you're in South Asia. Circumstances surrounding Rana Plaza complicate matters further in Bangladesh. During years and months before and in weeks after the collapse, a long series of Dhaka garment factory fires has killed many more Bangladeshi working women. I know of no official cumulative account of fatal fire fatalities, but certainly thousands have been injured and died in these fires since the export of stitched clothing from Bangladesh took off in the 1980s and rapidly displaced the dying jute industry as the company's leading export earner of foreign exchange, which is the garments are now followed by migrant labor and farmed shrimp in terms of their importance for the Bangladeshi foreign exchange earnings. And those two industries also have their horror stories, which I won't go into, but which have also attracted a lot of international attention from human rights and labor and environmental activists. But garment factory fires and events in the garment industry have definitely hit the headline most often. And they appear vividly online in the photography of Abir Abdullah, for example, who won the 2013 Alexia Foundation Award for Photojournalism that, quote, gives voice to those who go unheard and fosters cultural understanding and exposes social injustice. Dangers facing workers and potentials for massively expensive corporate legal liability for deadly working conditions are thus very visible in the public media, calling out for legal action. These are hardly secrets or lies that have been swept under the rug. But the law operates inside national territories, and this poses a problem for workers in Bangladesh, where the cultural politics and political economy of lawmaking and law enforcement are not entirely under the control of democratic forces that would force strong and costly labor protections for workers inside the country. It may seem logical to say, as The Economist does, that protection for workers is not forthcoming in Bangladesh because government is corrupt and inefficient and the population is preoccupied with disputes over national identity, the role of Islam, and the punishment of war criminals from 1971. Such charges against government assume that they rule national territory, however. They're reasonable ideas, but it's not necessarily true that the government actually rules the national territory over which it has authority. And in many poor countries today, governments simply do not. To put it simply, Bangladesh is not simply or only a national territory. It is also a global space, and that is the gist of my presentation today. The same argument, I'd have to say, pertains to in many parts of Asia, and I focus on Bangladesh because it's emblematic of wider historical trends. I start with these deadly garment factory events because their victims, perpetrators, underlying material conditions, reports, pictures, stories, and respondents and analysts all clearly inhabit global space, which indicates in turn that we should not imagine Bangladesh anymore as being only a national territory located inside the world region that we call South Asia. Bangladesh is a label on clothing that travels the world. It's a site of citizenship for hundreds of thousands of workers, students, and business people who travel the globe, often settling abroad on all the continents. It's a national state authority and government that is officially responsible for law and order in the international arena, for fiscal order, and for upholding international agreements. It is in all these ways, and many more, an integral part of the world of global capitalism. In that world, it is also, like every other country, anchored spatially by major urban centers that are networked into the global economy, which are privileged sites for global travel and investment, and are also privileged sites for labor immigration and capital accumulation. In that respect, Bangladesh consists of national regions attached to global networks which connect its capital city, Dhaka, to other world cities, and these networks of globalization make Dhaka the primary site for economic growth in the country, and they also make Dhaka today, in the words of the World Bank, the fastest growing megacity in the world. In this light, conventional approaches to area studies are not, or perhaps not, as relevant today as they were when they were institutionalized in the post-war decades, when they suited a world of national states that came into being then. They do not suit as well the world of globalization. Yes, it is true that Bangladesh is part of a larger Bengal region. Oh, there we are. Okay, good, there it is. Part of a larger Bengal region, nestled geographically in the combined deltas of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra rivers, and nestled culturally and historically in South Asia's Indo-Gangetic basin. But Bangladesh is also closely connected to India's culturally distinctive Northeast and to Burma and Southeast Asia, so it straddles world regions in conventional area studies. It has also doubly separated itself politically from Indo-Gangetic South Asia, first at the partition of British India in 1947, and secondly from Pakistan in a bloody war of independence in 1971. It is thus quite typical for scholars and analysts generally to marginalize Bangladesh when they study South Asia, because it is, in reality, on the edge, at the margins, outside the mainstream, located, actually, in separate geographies. Bangladesh fosters strong national self-identity that is both Deshi and global, and Bangladeshis have actively also been involved in the political world of neoliberal economic policy reforms from the very beginning of their national history. Political and economic crises in the 1970s quickly pushed Bangladesh into the ambit of the World Bank, IMF, and U.S. economic policy making because the national government became deeply dependent upon foreign financing, and this propelled national processes of economic privatization, fostered the massive growth of non-governmental organizations, and promoted export-import economic policies. Deprived of state funding, jute mills collapsed, jute exports and cultivation declined, foreign investors combined then with local businessmen and bureaucrats to launch the garment industry. The tragedy at Rana Plaza and fires in Bangladesh garment factories thus occur in sites of activity, investment, and experience which have multiple locations. They are indeed located in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, and in South Asia, but they also inhabit export-oriented Asia and the global South. Everyone involved in these factory events has a Bangladeshi address inside globalization, even as they also live inside specific neighborhoods in Dhaka. Their location in the world of globalization is on the underside of a great divide, which seems increasingly relevant. In rich countries of the global north, globalization appears to be a process of expanding world trade and cultural flows, with global markets integrating a planetary space of technological progress. But in poor countries of the global south, the modern world history is much more distressingly entangled in seemingly endless struggles with global inequity. The divisive global inequity is today increasingly visible inside and among countries around the world, and its implications pervade responses to Rana Plaza. Even optimists are skeptical that richer people in rich countries who benefit most from cheap Bangladeshi labor will bear the cost to improve working conditions in Dhaka. And radical pessimists decry what Vijay Prashad calls the terror of capitalism, evoking the U.S. war on terror, while even more moderate critics imagine Rana Plaza as being another event inside the long global history of the Great Divergence, which included not only the increasingly disproportionate wealth of the West, but also a long century of Western colonialism and capitalist imperialism. The inequity of globalization pervades global spaces inside Bangladesh, where The Economist reports that many members of parliaments have major investments in the garment sector, which is now worth, amazingly enough, some $20 billion, nearly double the size of the industry's worth as recently as 2011, because the European Union then relaxed its trade rules and increased Bangladeshi imports tremendously. This renders state action inside Bangladesh unlikely to result from democratic politics inside the country, reminding me, of course, of the likelihood that any major reform of financial institutions and tax codes that favor the rich will ever occur in the United States. That one of my humorous anecdotes I threw in there, just for you. Because 100% of the cloth produced in Bangladesh factories leaves the country for buyers in the West, and because critical inputs, including designs and finance, come from the West, Dhaka garment factories should also be located inside the global space of Western corporate capitalism. Understandably, therefore, in the press, global perspectives on Rana Plaza have been very prominent. For example, on 23rd of May, the Wall Street Journal's Dhaka correspondent wrote an article in The Guardian in the Global Development section, which is supported, I find, by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He wrote the article with this headline: "The Bangladeshi garment industry still offers women the best opportunity for work." And he emphasized the potential of a new proposed minimum wage law which could help women working in such harsh conditions. But then very enthusiastically and sympathetically said, "But you have to remember, the employers say they are also suffering as a result of disrupted production." In New York City, interestingly enough, labor activists immediately located Rana Plaza in global histories of garment manufacturing, which include the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in the neighborhood of my own university in New York City, in Greenwich Village, where on March 25, 1911, 146 garment workers died, many falling from the 9th floor of the factory. The sight of so many women workers, many teenagers, dying in broad daylight brought sweatshops into public view as never before. And in those days, dozens of workers died every day in the industrial accidents in New York City. The hope now is that the horrors of Rana Plaza will stimulate effective action to improve working conditions in Bangladesh garment factories. The Economist notably gave this subtitle to its lead article on Rana Plaza, for example. It said, "This tragedy shows the need for radical improvement of building standards and of safety standards." The big question then is how to make this change happen. The first step, in my view, is to realize that the political economy of the garment industry in Bangladesh is not defined inside the borders of the country, as it was in the United States, in New York City in 1911. The world has changed dramatically since then. Answering the practical question of how to improve garment factory conditions for women workers in Bangladesh requires that we develop a better understanding than we have today of how their world has been changing. Area studies hinder that effort to the extent that they are based conceptually on fixed territorial geography, which separates world regions and nations. That fixed imaginary is based on the idea that the world is covered entirely by national states endowed with fixed boundaries, cultures, and sovereign powers of self-government. Most of these nation-states came into being after 1950, and I want to argue that their formal institutional composition as national territories needs to be understood not as a permanent fact of life, but rather as a part of a long historical process or series of processes of territorial change. The world of globalization is not a world of deterritorialization, of crumbling boundaries and of free cultural flows, as some globalists argue. Rather, it's a changing historical space of ongoing re-territorialization, one feature of which is the institutional fixing of territorial boundaries around domains of legal sovereignty, represented by the world map of the United Nations. Inside the world of nations, established during the decades after World War II, a trend of so-called free market or neoliberal state policy reform swept the globe after 1970 to open up national states to increasing cross-border mobility, which does not represent a decline in the importance of state boundaries or national state territory, but rather represents or participates in a process of change in the rules of territorial control over human powers of spatial mobility, powers which have also increased because of technological change, notably through high-altitude transportation, computers, and the internet. In this changing world of nations, policy changes which have loosened state controls over the mobility of finance capital have enabled investors to exercise more power over all kinds of resources all over the world. Capital investors have been the greatest beneficiaries of economic globalization, and their powers are being secured by the managerial authority of national states. National states no longer accumulate capital by limiting spatial mobility, as they did during post-war decades of national state consolidation. Instead, territorial authorities enrich themselves by competing with one another to create conditions that are most attractive to investors. At every level, down to the city and the big cities, the small cities, the towns and villages, government today, or governance, you might say, with a little question mark around the use of the term governance, but let's leave that for the moment, is a process of negotiation involving mobile economic agents of many kinds, including workers, and territorial state authorities who depend for their power on mobile capitalists. This is one useful way to understand the world in which Bangladeshi garment workers face the dangers of daily life in the factory. The tragedy at Rana Plaza opens an even wider window into the history of globalization, however, by dramatizing the existence of a little-known commodity chain which coordinates the spatial mobility, processing, and combination of many constituent elements, including raw materials, machinery, labor, knowledge, artistry, and capital, all for one specific purpose: to deliver ready-made garments to buyers in Europe and the Americas. Bangladesh is not the only place where this is happening. Some version of it is happening in every country in Asia, which I define broadly to include the Middle East. Globalization, therefore, has a distinctive spatial design, which appears not only in patterns of economic growth and inequality and urbanism, but also in the systematic patterning of spatial mobility as goods and labor power in various forms move, in this case, for this example, or in this feature, from Asia to the West, and money flows mostly into Asian cities. This process of designing commodity chains and distributing their benefits constitutes the economic geography of globalization. It also has a very long history in Asia, going back to ancient times. It thus defines a distinctive history for globalization in Asia as compared to other regions of the global South, and also to Europe, I would say. That history helps us to better understand the historical space of Rana Plaza because it shows that geographies of territorial power change over time, and that state boundaries on maps do not enclose territories with fixed properties, because territorial authority is always engaged in dynamic negotiations with forces of human mobility. Asian states have worked since ancient times to control and regulate forces of human mobility on which they also depend for their own vitality. Commodity chains form a major spatial element in the history of interaction between territorialism and mobility because they've provided wealth for rulers, states, and elites, and they have thus been explicit objects of control for political strategists for a very, very, very long time. Commodity chains stretched and multiplied by land and sea to cover vast distances and engage countless producers, buyers, transporters, merchants, and financiers, and enticing Europeans for many centuries before Christopher Columbus found America by accident on his way to India, and Vasco da Gama finally managed to land in India, and they were both sailing in pursuit of control over Asian commodities. Alexander the Great, marching east, and the Mauryan Empire marching west, provide a useful point of departure in ancient times for spatial histories of Asia that focus on the production of territorial domains running along existing trade routes. These mobile imperial authorities sought to gather and to control, but also to expand wealth moving along these routes. And they brought with them cultural elements of many kinds, including religion, science, art, and engineering. They also left behind historical records, artifacts, and genetic legacies, including blue-eyed Afghans and Kashmiris. Ancient Chinese dynasties also marched west into the lands of warrior nomads, and this combination of imperial projects marching west and east in ancient times formed the basis of what became known to Europeans as the Silk Road, whose commercial composition is perhaps the best key to Asia's expansive commercial vitality. The combination of nomads, animal economies, intensive agriculture, natural resources, seasonal regularity, and ecological diversity that is so prominent in Asia clearly provides the material basis for routine social relations of everyday exchange and investment in strategic sites of urbanism along extensive routes of travel, where animals were arguably the mother of all commodities as well as a means of travel. What I call the Asian circulatory system also included routes from the Mediterranean down the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, down the east coast of Africa, around Indian Ocean, into the South China Sea from ancient times. These routes became more prominent over the centuries, most notably after the 13th century Mongol imperial integration of the Silk Road territories and Yuan and then Ming dynasty voyages to West India. The Ottomans similarly moved into the Indian Ocean from the west, and all the great early modern empires of Asia, Ottoman, Safavid, Mughals, Ming, and Qing, as well as the expansive states of South Asia, they all drew increasing wealth from increasing sea trade. Buddhism and Islam both moved and settled across spaces defined by changing territories of the Asian circulatory system that transgress our conventional fixed ideas about the geography of area studies, which separate East, Southeast, and Southeast Asia from each other and also, sadly, from the Middle East. This mapping of world areas erases all the old changing territorial configurations of power and culture across Asia that were being informed by and challenged over the centuries by mobile forces that included organized commodity chains, many involving luxury goods in great demand at court, but also carrying essentials of everyday life, commerce, and state power, such as horses, iron implements, and precious metals. When Europeans arrived on the scene in the 16th century, Asia's circulatory system was sufficiently influential locally in all the regions and sufficiently visible to many observers, most famously Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, that the Asian circulatory system, this is a map of medieval trade that was made, it's an old map that's been modernized in various ways. It's not a very good map, but I put it there because it has that old feeling to it, you know. But in any case, the point is that the interconnectedness of what I'm calling the Asian circulatory system was sufficiently visible in early modern times that it could well have become the basis for our understanding of modern Asian history. But that was not to be. I think the reason lies in the historical emergence of a modern Western hegemony that parceled out Asian territories based on access points for imagining Asia through hinterlands of port cities where the Europeans landed, so that all the internal overland connections among Asian cultures were lost to the European Orientalists, whose pragmatic specialization on learning separate classical cultures in Arabic, Sanskrit, Persian, and Chinese created vested interests in territorial separations that overlapped geopolitical maps of imperial modernity. Nationalist movements in Asia reinforced those territorial separations until it became national common sense to imagine each world region and all its constituent national territories as separate and analytically equal. Had the influence of Asian internationalism, which was very prominent in the 1920s and 30s, continued past the 1940s and flourished in the later decades, we might still have a better intellectual grasp. We might have had more intellectual pressure to integrate all the different regions of areas of Asian studies. But instead, as the world of separate regions came into existence after World War II, it became more commonplace to lump together countries and nations according to national characteristics, discounting the older spatial qualities of the social worlds of circulation inside Asia. Instead of thinking about the total spaces, for example, of Islam and Buddhism, which are just expansive and spread all over the place, very prominently in the eastern parts of Asia, connecting India and China, Central Asia, West Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, and so on. Instead of thinking about those worlds in their totality, we rather inherit knowledge based on ideas about regions that are based on concepts like post-colonialism, developing countries, north-south divisions, first, second, and third world, in addition to the purely geopolitical division of regions of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Asia's difference and connections, however, Asia's difference as a huge region of the world and connections among its internal regions have now become to emerge more visibly in the world of globalization. Efforts are most strenuous to link India and China, which is pretty true, pretty obvious, and it's pretty strong tendency right now. But other linkages are also appearing, for example, among port cities, and it would be good to discuss them. But I want to end my presentation today rather by refocusing our attention on the this is where we are. Okay, these are the empires of the Silk Road that were forming along and shaping the world of trade and interaction. This is a great map of British India. This is the increase of area of British India. Okay. I want to end by focusing on the spatial history of territorial control over commodity chains, which will lead us back to Bangladesh and Rana Plaza. It seems to me that the vogue of world history, which has tended to lump together all the countries of the global south by virtue of their shared history of subordination to the West, which is real enough, still obscures important differences. Asia and Europe have a special relationship that separates them from the Americas. In the Americas, European expansion was from the outset an imperial project of territorial expansion, and American national cultures all defined themselves from the beginning as European derivatives in juxtaposition and opposition to Europe. Asian cultures have a separate history in which the European connection is specifically modern. Before early modern times, Asian histories operated entirely separately from Europe for 2,000 years. Europeans came to Asia because it was a separate world of culture, known to Europe for its wealth and for its valuable commodities. which had arrived in Europe for centuries. Europeans rounded Africa, sailing to Asia in pursuit of control over existing commodity chains, starting with spices but quickly focusing on a wide range of commodities, notably cotton cloth, which was produced primarily on coastal regions of South Asia that were by the 17th century all ruled by Mughal lines, though not all by Mughal rulers. In every region of Asia, Europeans used existing territorial systems of power to gain control of commodity chains, redesign their spatial form, and direct their benefits to Europe. That goal remains the primary object of Western policies in Asia to this day. In the Americas, plantations, mines, farms, ranches, and factories, under direct personal European command, built foundations for extensive commodity chains to benefit Europe. In Asia, Europeans rarely acquired direct control over commodity production, and to control commodity chains, they had to rely on systems of power that could be manipulated from long distance. Until World War I, expansive systems of imperial territorialism provided a legitimate basis for control over commodity chains. These two pictures are absolutely two of my favorites, and juxtaposing them is something I love to do. One is from the Panchanama of Darbar at the Shah Jahan's court, indicating the arrival of all sorts of commodities on people's bodies. Very, very prominently, the role of cloth is very prominent there, but also people bowing down to the ruler as part of their participation in the imperial system is very prominent there. And on the right, we have a lithograph from Rennell's map of India in 1772, where you see people, the Brahmins, bowing down, delivering the keys to the kingdom, with the temple and the Britannia and the lion and the military force behind, with the merchants and the cartographers in the shadows on the left, getting ready to take their piece of the pie. So it's a very, very exciting and interesting representation of the extent to which the instruments of European power over commodities and commodity chains in India really were based upon and built upon Mughal imperial foundations. And there you could go on that line forever. So, in any way, until World War I, expansive systems of imperial territorialism provided a legitimate basis for control over commodity chains. In British India, the transformation of the cotton cloth chain in particular was most dramatic, as the Raj effectively killed cotton cloth exports from India, which had dominated world supplies in the 18th century, and moved all the spinning and weaving to England, leaving India as a provider of raw cotton and consumers, and as a consumer of British cloth. It's not surprising then that in that light, capturing control of the cotton commodity chain became a rallying cry for Indian nationalism, and the industrialization specifically and very prominently of cotton cloth, reindustrialization of cotton cloth in India, became a hallmark of national development. By the 1880s, annual government publications indicate that South Asia was a massive provider of raw materials for the world economy. And I won't go into the details here, but we can if we want. Basically, South Asia's role in the world economy in the 18th century was, insofar as it was involved in the world economy, it was producing manufactured cotton material. By the 19th century, it was much more massively involved in the world economy. Almost every part of it, you can hardly find a part of British India that wasn't in some kind of way embroiled in the world economy. And that entanglement was entirely based on the provision of raw materials and, of course, of finances and taxation and so on for the government. But the financial basis of the taxation was in turn based on commodity chains that ultimately led overseas in exports. Every region of India had their own special export specialization. Commodity chains were located in particular places. People know about Maharashtra, for example, being cotton country. Darjeeling tea is there. Places became brand named on the basis of their role in the global commodity chains. South Asia became the basis for commodities that went all over the world. Jute became British India's signature crop for the transition to industrialism. India, and almost all the world's jute grew in eastern Bengal, in Bangladesh. It all went to Scotland and into Kolkata, where jute cloth and eventually it was brought back. The industrialization was brought back into Kolkata, where jute output surpassed Dundee by the early 20th century. The story here basically is, and we can talk about cotton and jute as being best examples of this, that the industrialization of India was basically a reconfiguration of the commodity chains concerning these major crops that were grown in India. So you went from a situation of India being entirely a raw material producing place to a place where also the commodity chains included large amounts of industrial output produced in India, in British India, including in Kolkata, Bombay, and Nagpur, and various other major cities. Most of the profit of these factories were in the hands of the British, but large chunks of them were in the hands of major Indian industrialists, best known, of course, being the Tatas, who became really the icons of national development. So that industrialization and the creation of an industrial capacity that keeps urban sites in a more powerful position in the production of goods for the world economy became a sign of India's emergence, or South Asia's emergence, we might say, as a more privileged place in the world economy. And this was actually starting to become the case as early as the 1920s. And by the early part of the 1930s, as Dietmar is actually one of the great scholars of this, you find that British India was actually becoming one of the most industrialized parts of the global South. The Great Depression and the Great Bengal Famine during World War II further solidified nationalist commitments to create an industrial and an economic basis for their countries that would provide self-sufficiency in all essential commodities and would promote rapid industrialization to create commodity chains that could be held inside South Asia and would produce advanced economies that were not dependent upon on the Europeans and on international trade, and they were the commitments. This was true through everywhere in Asia, actually, but different countries had different sets of possibilities. India had vast capital resources and powerful business families with influence in government, for whom closing national markets after 1947 meant capturing a vast population of consumers and government subsidies. But the closure of national markets and nationalization of key strategic industries, as well as restrictions on enterprise and consumption, which kept the commodity chains inside the country and enabled the country to develop a more advanced industrial basis, began to crimp on the Indian industrialists at a certain point in time, and also to limit the aspirations of the middle class. The oil price boom and the world recession of the 1970s unraveled India's old state planning strategy and opened the door to a more open market alliance with businesses that is still in India is more restrictive in foreign business than in many Asian countries, notably Bangladesh, where military rulers threw open the door wide to foreign investors in the 1970s. So what you find is that after 150 years of India being utilized as an imperial site for the production of commodities that would be flowing out into the world economy, and commodity chains whose origins in production would be in India, but whose profits and whose benefits would primarily be going to people in other parts of the world, Indian nationalism and nationalism in Asia generally became substantially committed to the idea of maintaining the benefits of commodity chains and maintaining as much of the length and breadth of the commodity chains as possible inside autonomous national states. And this involved industrialization. It involved import substitution. substitution. It involved regulations on exports and imports. It involved a lot of national subsidies for consumption inside the country, because otherwise people wouldn't have been able to afford to buy. The commodity chain wouldn't have been able to find consumers in the country. And this was really the model of the post-war, of the post-war development regime. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all the countries did it, but they each had different capacities to make it work. Pakistan launched the same kind of regime, but of course discriminated pretty drastically against Bengalis, and that became a source of nationalist resentment in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, after 1971, there was really no basis for maintaining this kind of strategy at all. There had been no jute mills in East Pakistan before 1947. The Pakistani mills that were set up there were never a huge success, and were really losing ground very rapidly after 71. And as that industry died, the military governments that came into place after the killing of Sheikh Mujib's family in 1975 moved very quickly from a dependence on foreign aid to the neoliberal strategy of economic development. So that's when the garment industry was really born in Bangladesh. And it has grown by leaps and bounds ever since, most dramatically since the return of civilian government and opening of full-scale electoral democracy in 1990. And then again, in the last decade. It actually weathered, the Bangladeshi garment industry actually weathered the financial crisis with unexpected ease. And it seems largely because of the fact that it was able to provide goods in Bangladesh, in Bangladeshi factories, cheaply enough that people who were hard hit by the financial crisis, consumers who were hard hit by the financial crisis in the U.S. and Europe, and mostly actually in the U.S. where the damage was most severe, they were still able to buy Bangladeshi cloth. So that Bangladeshi cloth actually increased its position in the world market after 2008. The vitality of the industry and its attractiveness to buyers in the Western markets lies in the competitive advantage that Bangladesh industrialists hold because of the cheapness and relative discipline of its labor force. Relative discipline means the lack of union action, the lack of union disruption, and so on. Discipline always needs to be read as a lack of union organization to collective action. But it's understood, the code word is definitely individual workers show up on time, they get their pay, they go home, they don't raise any troubles, and so on. And that's the definition of a disciplined workforce. Operative definition in the business world. The growth of the industry also, we have to say, and you can see briefly in this little capsule form that I've given, the growth and strength of the industry also provides a pillar for national state stability, wealth, and aspirations. In other words, it's the building of the garment industry is a national and even a strong nationalist project in Bangladesh. And it's no wonder, therefore, that for the majority of the population, the obvious dependency of the industry, and indeed much of the economy, on foreign businesses, employers, and consumers is really not a problem at all, because provisioning global supply chains with workers, cloth, and shrimp is a source of national pride for national elites. In that light, it seems most likely that forces of change in the working conditions of work, in the working conditions for garment factories, will have to include collaboration with global business interests. And recent reports indicate that this is what's happening, and that European firms are more amenable to this collaboration than American companies. Now, why this is the case, I don't know. As you can see, this is very much work that's in progress. The shifting ground upon which we're operating here is really quite stunning in many respects. One way or the other, however, it's quite obvious that any solution will need to include the input and collaboration of the key players in the global supply chain. I look forward to learning more about this with you in the near future. But for now, I want to leave you with the following thoughts. And sorry for sort of the jumping around and incoherence of this, but here we go. We're wrapping it up, and we should be happy after that. Number one, long-distance levers of power based on state authority and finance capital in rich countries are very much part of national environments in many Asian countries, including Bangladesh. It's not like there's a world economy and then there's national economies. In Asia, the world economy is actually inside the countries that we're talking about. Commodity chains that enrich the lives of consumers and investors in Western countries are the source of the leverage that the people use when they're trying to design and mobilize resources inside countries like Bangladesh. Commodity chains running over long distances at the same time. We have to remember commodity chains running over long distances have been a part of everyday life in Asian localities for many centuries, and controlling those commodity chains have been very much part of what politics is about. Politics from the Mauryan Empire to the Mughal Empire to the British Empire to the modern nation state has been very, very much about the control, the design of commodity chains and the allocation of benefits and profits from those chains, and also from the symbolic, even from the symbolic value of the consumption of commodities. So it's a very powerful part of politics. And I think we need to really think of globalization in that light. Because what I'm arguing here is that globalization is in significant measure a set of national policies induced by the financial needs and ambitions of nationalist development regimes that render states political instruments for the territorial management of global commodity chains. Finally, improving the conditions of workers in Bangladesh garment factories will have to necessarily involve collaboration among key people in the commodity chain at various levels of scale, not just inside the country. We cannot rely on governments alone to prevent tragedies like Bhopal and Rana Plaza. Thank you very much.